are joined today by Amber Bennett, who's a leading climate communications strategist and deputy director of Re.Climate. Is that how we pronounce it? Re.Climate, or do you spell it R-E climate? How do you say it?
Re.Climate. Yeah.
Re.Climate. Okay. A new center for climate change communication and engagement at Carleton University. Previously, she led the Alberta Narratives Project, which created a guide to talking about climate and energy in new, open, constructive ways. And this massive groundbreaking project held 50 province-wide discussions with nearly 500 people from a wide range of groups: farmers, oil sands workers, energy leaders, business leaders, youth, environmentalists, and more. She's based in Calgary. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, we're working now on our first ever voter's guide for Alberta. We've already found the province's leaders are having a very different conversation on a lot of our issues than we've seen when we were working on voters' guides for Ontario and BC. So, to start out with, could you give us a sense of how does the public understanding and dialogue about climate in particular differ in Alberta from the rest of the country?
Yeah, well, despite what the rest of Canada might think, and probably even what Albertans think, we're not that different than the rest of Canada.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, in terms of, like overall belief in climate, 9 out of 10, very similar to the rest of Canada, would say 9 out of 10 Albertans, 9 out of 10 Canadians would say climate's happening. Just under half would question the degree to which human activity plays a role in climate change, also very similar to the rest of Canada. And support for things like net zero targets, things like support for clean energy, etc., all track very similar to the rest of Canada. And also, what tracks very similar to the rest of Canada are support for either kind of less oil and gas production or development, more oil and gas production and development, or stay the same. And so in the rest of Canada and in Alberta, you basically see a third, a third, a third. So we're as divided on kind of similar questions that you see in the same way as you might see in other parts of Canada. We do have a little lower levels of literacy. So, like, what are the causes? What are the kind of policy solutions that you might put forward around climate? But to be honest, the rest of Canada's pretty subpar as well. The big differences, if you're interested, in Alberta to the rest of Canada would be this kind of tension that you see around people, people's values around protecting the environment versus protecting the economy. And I think what's interesting is that in Alberta, the economy and the energy sector, or oil and gas or fossil fuel production, is so closely tied together that what you see is this kind of relationship between energy and the environment that you don't see in other places. So the big difference here is that people relate and feel that there's a choice between protecting the environment or protecting the oil and gas industry, for more or less. And so that doesn't really exist in other places. And I think the other piece that would be a little bit different here is the timeline for transition. So this is less kind of coming from surveys, more from focus groups. We recently did a large piece of work, and we held focus groups with mostly people who kind of sit in the middle of the political spectrum. And when we talked about transition, most people would say it's inevitable, very similar to the rest of Canada. But what is difficult is, when is that timeline? So what I came away from those focus groups kind of understanding is that it's very difficult for Albertans to imagine an Alberta beyond oil. So yes, energy transition will happen, but when is kind of a question mark.
How do you go about bridging that conversation then in Alberta, what are the starting points with different kinds of audiences to dig more deeply into the timeline for that transition and what's doable, what's in people's what gives advantages for the provinces by acting more quickly or more slowly?
Yeah. Well, the degree to which people in Alberta support an energy transition depends a lot on their perception of how well they or their family will thrive in that transitioned economy. So there's a direct correlation, which is maybe not surprising. It's like if I think that I'm going to thrive, then I'm supportive of a transition. If I don't think that's the case, then I tend to double down on my beliefs in the future of oil and gas, and I tend to become more oppositional to an oil and gas transition. So I think when you kind of, even unprompted, but when you start to explore this conversation with people, diversification is kind of across the board, doesn't matter where you sit on a political spectrum. There's a lot of common ground for people. So the idea that Albertans are tired of a boom and bust economy. Yeah, it's great when it's really, really good, but it really sucks when it's really bad. And very few people, I think, at this point wouldn't have some sort of connection with someone who has lost their job or has struggled through those downturns. So I think common ground is definitely around the need for diversification, the need to get out of boom and bust, and the opportunities and growing opportunities related to kind of other types of sectors. Now, that's not to say start a conversation about diversification, but yeah, let's talk about tech, let's talk about film, let's talk about, healthcare research, let's talk about, other kinds of things that we can build here that would allow us to have a good quality of life. And one last point, when we were in focus groups, we were talking to a couple groups of moms, and we asked them, would you recommend your children go into jobs in oil and gas? And across the board, didn't matter. They universally said no. And so
Hmm.
I think at the same time, they talked a lot about um, how their children uh, don't see a future here necessarily in Alberta because of the political culture or because of the economic opportunities or whatnot. So I think that for some people, but safe ground is really talking about the need to build opportunities for people that provide more stability, that allow us to live here and have a good quality of life and, keep our families together and our chickens, close to the nest.
I want to hear more about that. That's really interesting that, of course, that resonates with us coming from an organization advocating for generational fairness. That I'm surprised. Why do tell me more why the moms worry about their kids being in oil and gas and why they worry they don't have a future in Alberta? What do they feel is driving them away?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that what surfaced in the conversation, well, I mean, there's kind of a couple different pieces that we could unpack. One, there was this great piece of research that was done by an Alberta, Calgary-based Calgary Economic Development, and I think it was the Calgary West Foundation. And I can kind of circle back to that. But firsthand, in the focus groups that we were doing, um, again, it goes back to that piece where uh, this kind of tension around, on the one hand, people don't see a future in oil and gas. They don't want to it will inevitably, transition. And so, but on the other hand, it's hard to see in Alberta beyond oil. So for us, it's like interesting. Somewhere in there is a timeline that we're all collectively holding around transition. It is not exactly short enough for the people who currently work there, but it's not long enough for people's children to have an entire career. So somewhere in there, I don't know if that's 20 years or if that's 25 years or 30 years, there is a sense that the industry won't be, the backbone or the kind of economic engine that it is or has been. I think the other pieces that kind of came up in those conversations were around political culture. So this kind of perception that Albertans are, not progressive, not open, not culturally diverse, things like that. That kind of came up in the conversations that were happening or that we had. And so moms talked about them wanting to go to the big city or wanting to go to Vancouver or wanting to go to these like cool places. And that's just not, arts and culture. It's not what they'll find here. And I think that there's kind of degrees of that. It's like if you live in rural Alberta, you're not going to stay there. You're going to come to kind of more urban centers in Alberta. If you live in urban centers in Alberta, you'll go to, other cooler cities, in other parts of Canada. And so there was that piece, and then bear with me, but a piece of this is also just the kind of their sense of where they live is a part of their own personal identity, right? They don't want to be seen to be, kind of super conservative, climate denying, all of the stereotypes that have been kind of piled onto people who live here. They don't want to be seen to be those people because they don't see themselves that way. So that also has a bit to do with where they choose to live. And that was a really interesting work that kind of came out of the research that I was talking about.
It strikes me on that front that, that's clearly an audience in Alberta that's, close to the hearts of Generation Squeeze. I mean, that's a group of people that were already trying to engage and wanting to find more and more of them engaged more and more on these issues. And so one of the things that struck me, Amber, about your work in the past is it provided both guidance to Gen Squeeze and also, I think, showed a way in which we have an opportunity to contribute to the climate change movement. And that's because I think your, previous research that others have led has said, like, as you've identified earlier, like moms or women generally are like a really a rich audience to be reaching out to. Simultaneously, there's also a kind of younger audience that matters, and so those are two sweet spots for Gen Squeeze. And I wonder, what about those audiences ought we be thinking more about as we're trying to engage effectively? And what about the Gen Squeeze work that we're doing are assets for us as we're trying to reach out, perhaps not even first and foremost, like, hey, come talk to us about climate change. But the reason we attract a lot of women and younger people generally is like we talk about family policy, we talk about housing affordability. And those are other issues that I think are sweet spots for those kinds of demographics. So what kind of advice do you give to a group like ours or to others who are trying to maybe build on some of the assets that we have?
Yeah. Well, before I head straight to advice, the one I think what I didn't mention, and it would be helpful to mention, is this great piece of work that came out of the University of Alberta. And there's a researcher there called Dr. Jared Wesley. And he took a look at, how do Albertans see themselves? And so he kind of did this interesting exercise. He asked people to draw, your typical Albertan. And by and large, for the most part, people drew, either an oil rig worker or a farmer, rancher kind of person, predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly conservative, oppositional, etc. And when you kind of lay that side by side to where are we, it's very, very different. That is not who we are, And so we last year did some work where we did a segmentation of who are Albertans, and we kind of oriented it around climate. And For the most part, Albertans have very centrist values, like objectively centrist political values. So the majority of Albertans sit either in the center or left of center. And with that, they hold kind of progressive environmental values. And very few people, less than 15%, fit that kind of stereotype that kind of um, came up in the exercise. But that person who he named Joe Alberta kind of limits our public imagination of who we are and what is politically possible and what's the kind of policy that we can have here. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about, first and foremost, like let's just make those people more visible, not only to the rest of Canada, but to ourselves, to kind of increase this sense of belief and um, you know possibility that yeah, we can live in a place that aligns with and supports the kind of vision I have for the place where I want to live. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would say to most groups is, climate's like super polarized here, still is. There are very well funded groups who have worked very hard to make it toxic on purpose. But that's not to say that climate doesn't connect to everything we care about. So we can have a conversation about anything really, and it can be a climate change conversation. So whether that's about affordability or if that's about future job opportunities or health or inflation or protection of nature, or there's lots of different kind of entry points into those conversations. And and there's lots of openness to have those conversations as well. It doesn't matter, you mentioned it at the top. We talk to farmers. Farmers are very happy to talk about the weather. They're very, happy to talk about water and water availability. They're very happy to talk about food security and the role that agriculture could provide in future economic opportunities, et cetera. So there's lots of opportunity, but I think in Alberta, perhaps more so than in other places, who is having the conversation really, really, really matters. When you ask people unprompted, like who's trusted, doctors
Tell
are
us.
trusted, healthcare professionals are trusted, academics are trusted, scientists are
Woohoo!
trusted, small business leaders are trusted. Who is not trusted? Environmentalists are not. Not surprising. There's been a lot of work done um, to undercut the credibility of environmentalists in the province. With the exception of environmentalists are trusted on the environment. So talk about, clean air, clean water, nature protection. That's your lane. And Albertans have a strong environmental or conservation ethic, so they want environmentalists to talk about that. What they don't want them to talk about is economic policy. And so part of, I think, in Alberta, given how much effort is put into kind of polarizing this conversation, who is leading the conversation is really, really important. So I think that piece around stay in your lane applies across the board, right? So doctors should talk about health. They also should not talk about economic policy. Economists should talk about economic policy. Um, Political leaders aren't trusted, period. And For a group like Gen Squeeze, I think you would be, as a research organization, as an economic organization. I mean, I've heard you, Paul, give great interviews on and reflect back to Alberta, like what is it? Why, it's great to be here. Why? Because you can still afford to live here. And so as a researcher who thinks about that, who has the evidence behind it, who can speak with, experience and authenticity, you're super credible on that. Would I recommend you talk about technology or like just stay in your lane? And I think there's lots of people are very happy to engage and to listen to what you have to say.
And just to riff off that, just for my own clarification, because we're
Yeah.
thinking about Alberta right now, the election, and how to get some of our own voters' guides in front of people. But it
Yeah.
sounds to me that you're on the one hand saying, there's just a large part of the Alberta population that is sort of generally oriented to these sort of middle ground values, and that you don't need to think about over targeting, like go after that big, mushy kind of middle where lots and lots of Canadians are generally, because you'll find lots and lots of Albertans there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And affordability is one of the topics that,
Sweet spot.
right, that has surfaced and rises to the list for so many people. And far, far higher than climate. That's in Alberta, that's anywhere. So yeah, people want to hear about affordability. They want to hear what people have to say, solutions, policy, what they can expect, what they can, advocate for themselves or their friends, their family. And I think and I'm sure that you know this, and you probably could tell me, but I imagine that there's the people that you think about, but then their parents and the people uh, who want the best for them are also probably a next sphere of advocates for you, right? So it's like not only are you talking about kind of youth, but probably their parents too, who are seeing like, oh right, it isn't possible for them to buy a house. This is a very different kind of world and context that they live in, et cetera.
It's so interesting how much you've talked about these points of common ground where it's easier to talk to people about these issues and where you can easily meet them. And I guess as long as you're in your lane. But something we struggle with a lot is at some point you got to get to the hard truth. And how do you navigate those bridges? I think a recent example for us is pollution pricing is a cornerstone of our climate policy solutions. But the PBO report kind of reminded us that not all Canadians are on board with it. So, but at the same time, we need to talk about it. How do you talk in a way that works and you can still find those points of agreement?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a nice, neat answer for you. The pollster that we worked with, Janet Brown, likes to say that, um, you know, the big difference for Albertans is that they don't like to pay taxes. And I think it's kind of true. Like, Albertans kind of just don't like to pay taxes. So anything that's talking about a tax is going to be difficult. If you want to talk about, um, you know, a home innovation fund or a home safety fund, or I mean, I think it has to do with, in many ways, the fact that we have spent a lot of time talking about how the mechanism works and not what it does, and certainly not the benefits that people will see out of it. And I, talk about this stuff all day, every day, and it still is kind of hard for me to believe, like, you're gonna take tax from me, but then I get it all back. Like, I don't understand how that works, right? It doesn't make sense. And so I think that, one way, appreciating the fact that people don't like to pay taxes, they don't really trust the government to do real things with their taxes. That aside, it would be really helpful to start talking about what is the carbon tax revenues doing? How has it been invested? What are the kinds of results that we're seeing? And make it practical and tangible and something that people can see, make it visible in our daily lives. So, whether those are businesses that have received, funding and supports, for clean tech investment, or, whatever it might look like. I think if we can start to point to, here's what it does, and this is how it benefits you, and this is how you can see it in your daily life, that would go a long way to to helping, um, and providing something specific to talk about, rather than it just being about this kind of um, theoretical disagreement on who gets to tax me and then gets to decide what to do with my money, which is kind of where it gets sticky.
That's interesting. When you started your answer saying like, oh, so much of the talk about pricing pollution and gets sucked into the weeds about this sort of tax conversation, and you lose people. And I'm like, okay, so she's going to tell us to come and bring it sort of the values place, but you kind of kept it as sort of more middle ground about, well, let's talk about like what the revenue's doing and the good things it's creating and whatnot. But I wonder a little bit about that, Amber, at this moment, because I think at the heart of the pricing pollution conversation in this country and across the planet, it is like, is pollution free or not? Or is pollution harmful? And if pollution's harmful, then, people should take responsibility for the harm that they're causing and, admittedly, pay a contribution for that. So I partly wonder about like, is that conversation, that values conversation, that pollution isn't free, that we should take responsibility for our actions, does that not hold as much in Alberta? And what motivates the question I have right now is that, we've been looking very carefully, not only at the policy announcements being put out by the parties, but just the general discourse around the election in Alberta right now. And for listeners who aren't paying as much attention, where Alberta really is on fire, like in May in a way that it hasn't been on fire, it's such a horrific degree in a really long time. But there is a discomfort, I think, in Alberta about talking about the extreme weather and the harm that that's causing so many people, thousands of people evacuating and whatnot, loss of livestock, homes, etc. But I don't see an obvious conversation then emerging in the election right now. And like, well, this relates to our broader approach to addressing the amount of carbon that we're emitting and how that's causing climate change and the tools available to us to try and fend off this harm. So here's my last long-winded way of asking. I think I figured out my question while I was talking to you. Never great for a podcast. I'm witnessing in Alberta people doing many, many lovely things for one another. Like, you're out of your home, come into mine. Let me feed you. Let me give you clothing. Let me provide you some shelter. I'm going to be an amazing neighbor in the middle of this disaster. That takes so much more effort from community members than it would to do some of the much more modest things to try and prevent or reduce extreme weather from causing as many fires or as floods as it's doing. How come that connection isn't being made in the middle of an election or more generally?
I'm not sure where to start, Paul. I think the things that came up for me when you were talking is just around literacy, to what degree people make a connection between extreme weather, pollution, carbon tax, government, solutions, etc. I think there's so many steps between all of those pieces, that, taxing pollution for people who are thinking about this, who have been involved in the conversation, is, yes, that's a very straightforward conversation. I think for people who have very limited bandwidth, whose priorities are around health and their health care, and who are, who are not thinking about this, who are not spending more than 30 minutes a year thinking about this, or the causes of climate change and how it relates, of which we know there's, a significant portion, more than half of the population, fall within that. I think these kind of complicated policy conversations are just not, it's too many steps for a lot of people. So I think the kind of literacy piece is important when we're talking about policy. I think the other piece that's important is just around trust right? So it's like, even if I understand the relationship between taxing pollution and and I can get past the Canadian versus global, emissions piece, if I can get over that, um, do I trust the government to say what it's going to do with my taxes? Is a question mark, I think, for a lot of people. So I think, yes, um, perhaps the kind of quickest answer to this is, the kind of certainty in which, you have support from economists for this kind of tool is very helpful. I think for people who don't, follow the conversation closely, that's like a good kind of reinforcing. It's like 99% of economists agree that, we need to, tax pollution. I think the values piece around, yes, taxing pollution is bad and we need to make polluters pay. That framing works. It does work. I guess what I'm just saying is that there's a lot of other, it kind of falls down when you get into the weeds, right? When you get into the weeds of what political party are you talking about? What solution are you specifically talking about? Who, and then the kind of persistent and relentless and insidious misinformation that is infused into the conversation as well. And the kind of dominant narratives around, yeah, I'm a good person, but why do I have to sacrifice my well-being, in a global situation? I don't want to, I'm not, why do I have to, take that sacrifice until other countries are going to step up? Those kind of dominant narratives are so insidious, and so, like, in every single focus group, that's what's going to come up. So what I'm suggesting is like, sidestep that and just start talking to people about things that they in their own personal experience can see, can trust, can have a sense that this is going to benefit me and my community and the people I love. And it's real and it's tangible. So if we can start talking to people about tangible things that they can see and appreciate with their own, within their own lives, I think that would help, because a lot of this gets sidelined by, this in Alberta anyhow. It's like, well, it's just not practical. It's all those progressives and that ideological stuff and et cetera. And so I think we need to just get more real with people. Even as the world burns, we can't, there's no shortcut, unfortunately. That's what I think. And I'd be happy, I'm sure that listeners or other people will say other things, but those are the things that come to mind for me.
It's so given the kind of sort of the literacy gap, or the so many steps between talking about policy levers like pricing pollution and then seeing how that relates to extreme weather. It clearly isn't good politics right now. You don't have either of the leading parties really making any effort to say, wow, we're really frightened right now about the fires that are burning down towns and causing so much damage, and smoking out now Calgary, where we're meeting with you today, and in a way that I think some of the photos look a little bit apocalyptic, and we can resonate here in British Columbia with so many of our cities and towns, blackened by smoke in recent summers. So it's not good politics. But I worry, you said, like, there's a lack of trust amongst residents of Alberta, and we see this across the country, a lack of trust in government to lead effectively. And this seems to be then a problem to fix a lot of broken systems, whether it's like housing unaffordability, whether it is, climate change. Until recently, I might have said it was like problems just around investing in childcare. But we can only do those things through public policy change. We can only do them through government. And so Oftentimes in Gen Squeeze, we're in the business of rejuvenating democracy. I think, one of the reasons we say this, like, we think we need to be in the business and like rejuvenating trust in our governments, even if you don't like some parties or some particular individuals, but that the institutions themselves really matter because individuals can't solve this big systemic problems alone. We have to do it through our activities as communities and cities, and governments are the way that we do that.
Yeah, and I guess I believe that if we can tell stories where things worked and where they are working, um, and then draw connections to people's lives, that helps to address the kind of defensiveness that we're all collectively holding around we're going to hell in a handbasket. Governments are not stepping up and acting quickly enough to protect us and have our best interests in mind. And so that's where you kind of get apathy or this, lack of engagement. If it doesn't feel like it's going to make a difference, then why bother? But if we can tell stories where it has made a difference, this has been effective. I think that those nuggets help to break through the defensiveness that we have and help us, open up with a sense of trust. And this kind of, falling trust is something that is happening, in it's like a global
Jurisdictions around
problem,
the
right?
world. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but to go back to that point around, well, then what is the role of people who we do trust in helping to act as translators between what governments or public systems can do for us? What is the role of doctors to help educate us around like, and this is what this means, and this is how it's going to impact your daily life, right? Or for academics to do that, or other people. I think that if we can have those people that still have a certain amount of trust within the public act as translators, that will go a long way, provided that they're talking about things that people care about. Right? It's very hard to care about a carbon tax, right? But I would be very happy to talk about a retrofit program that makes my home more comfortable in the winter time or in the summer or whatnot, or a training program that or a new innovation uh, initiative to bring new industries into Calgary, whatever that might be. I care a lot about my children being able to live in this place. Talk to me about that. A carbon tax, it's hard.
We are low on time, and you just brought up something that I want to ask you about because, of course, you're a mom, and I'm curious what generational fairness means to you as a mom and climate communicator.
Yeah, I love that question. I'm sure that I could overthink this a lot, but
We
what I,
overthink generational fairness all the time. So join the club.
but what I think about is like, um, if you made the mess, help clean it up. That's what I think about when I think about generational
If
fairness.
you
My
made the
kids,
mess, help clean it up.
you know,
Let's quote Amber on that. Can we get that down on some sort of sticky that we then put onto,
It's
that's the social media poster for the day?
yeah, like they didn't make this mess. They should not have to clean it up. They're already going to be faced with so much change. Um, and so I think that that it really comes down to us cleaning up the mess before they are expected to take the reins. That's what generational fairness means to me. Um, and boy, do we talk a lot about cleaning up your mess in my house. So as a mom, That's like a really well-worn track.
So then you need to look in the mirror. Here we have to provide that mirror. I wonder if that can intersect though a little bit with who we trust, because I do think we trust mums um, and grandmas. And so that's, as you indicated earlier, that's an important part of the audience for a generation squeeze. We're concerned with the generations being squeezed, but we're also really concerned with, the mums and grandmas out there and grandparents more generally who are worried about what are they leaving behind? Is it as good as they'd hoped it would be for their kids and grandchildren? And so, is that a starting place for conversations that may take us sometimes to pricing pollution or may take us to other places that are easier to chat about? But like just this conversation about the legacy. Is it the legacy that we want to be leaving? And can that be a strong starting point for a conversation that's sort of it's not about shaming. It's not about blaming. It's just like reflecting on, like, wow, is this what we had wanted to leave behind? And if not, to your point, like, what remains that we could do to help improve that legacy before it's too late?
Yeah. I would even go up one step further.
Please.
Um, and I think we still live in this kind of I don't want to call it a fantasy. That might be a bit harsh. But we still live in this time when we think climate change is change. Like it could change back.
Mm.
We could just
Mm.
put enough solar panels on something in which, we can get back what where we were. And I think it needs to be done with care. And I think it needs to be done with a lot of empathy. And I think as moms and grandmothers and as parents, we need to get real about the fact that we are never, ever going back, not in our generation or our children's or their children. We are locked in for centuries of this. And so I think that that will help when we're faced with decisions, be it on cost or investment or priorities, um, if we can get to a point where we are more real about where we're at, I think that we can that will help us make choices that are more reflective of where we're at. And I believe that women and parents and mothers have um, a very big capacity to have that kind of conversation. Um, that said, research would show that men in Alberta are a bit more real about, the inevitability of the transition than other demographics. So, I think there's so many good ways that you can kind of come into that, depending on where somebody has been and where they're coming from. If you are coming from a country in which, you are new here and you have seen firsthand, like all of the kind of layering stress and, realities that this conversation brings, um, you know, it really depends. And I guess kind of coming out of that is like, let's not stop there, but we kind of need to get a little bit real, connected to like, these are the things that I love. And that kind of love is what is going to like pull us through the hard conversation and into the motivation to do something differently.
Well, we have a lot of conversations on this podcast about talking about love or being angry, and so it's interesting to see that we've come back to this love theme right now. If I have time, Megan, can I have one more follow up? May I? May I?
I
May
want to
I?
follow up.
Okay, you have the follow up. Go
I
ahead,
have
follow up.
one
Yes, your turn.
because it's circling back to that painting behind you and what you were saying. Because I think what makes me feel the deepest grief is thinking about what's real now. I'm I feel horrified when I go to a place like back in Texas. There's all these wonderful nature preserves that reminds me of. And I remember taking my kids to one that I hadn't been to since one of the worst wildfires in Texas. And And so my memory of it was this incredible mountain that covered in aspen and pine trees, and I just had this vision of what my family's experience is going to be there. And we got there, and it was just like gone. It was just dirt covered mountain. And that's what my kids saw, and that's all they'll never know. And that's horrifying to me. Like, what's real now, if they accept that as normal, then so much has already been lost. And then I just get depressed. And yeah. So what do you do with those feelings? Do you have those too?
Well, you should have, Megan, we would have had a nice big cry probably about 5 hours ago when I woke.
Oh,
Um, can I tell you one little story about this painting? So
please,
I got
yes.
this painting while I was doing a project interviewing off-highway vehicle users in southern Alberta.
Hmm.
And so there was a big push to protect a big piece of land for grizzly bear habitat. And so
Hmm.
my job was, is I went and I did a whole bunch of kind of long interviews with these dudes who were off-highway vehicle users. And I think what I took away from that is that their connection to that land had everything to do with family and love and the fact that their family or father or grandfather had taken them to that place and they wanted to take their children to that place. How they connected with the land was that they got there through, with these ATVs and quads and things like that. That didn't mean that their connection to the land was any different than the others who were backpacking and, leave no trace and, et cetera. The way that they did it was different, but why they did it and what it meant to them when they got there was was really, the same. And they equated not being able to go to those places with the same grief that you've just explained. It's like it's lost, it's gone to them. Um, so, I don't have an answer to that really, other than we just need to, the more we can connect to those special places and spend time together, maybe not in the midst of a forest fire, but out of a forest fire comes new growth, right? Comes
Mhm.
a rebirth of other things. Nature can be as amazing even in a after a forest fire as it is, in full bloom. There's still things that are happening there. It is not void. And for children, that rebirth may be as a powerful a story that we need right now. The narrative that we can recover, that that there is still life, I think is very important for to carry them through the amount of change that they're going to have to face and figure out. Um, right? Nature's resilient. That is a message that all of us need to hear.
Mhm.
It will be different. It will not be the way that we see it now, but there will still be something there.
Mhm. Oh, there you go. Thank you. If you have time, do you have time for one more follow-up from Paul?
Sure, this is fun.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Well, but we need to end there. So this, if we do
Okay,
this, you'd
you
have to
can.
edit this back because that was just a lovely, nice place to
It
end
really.
a conversation. So we may or may not use this. I'm struck by the power again of your point. Like, if you made the mess, help clean it up. Actually, this is such a common theme across our issues when we talk about housing unaffordability or climate change or government debt or underinvestment in young people. These are all symptoms of the underlying disease, which we call generational fairness or unfairness. And we're telling to an older demographic, people we love, you kind of made a mess and you now got to clean it up with us. And the problem that we're having is people are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, I just played by the rules of the day. How could it have been that messy? What mess are you talking about that I made? I just did what the rules of the day told me to do. And so given how powerful a comms thinker you are, how would you go approach that kind of conversation to flag for some mums and dads later in their lives, like, damn, I mean, it wasn't just our kids making a mess, we kind of made a mess too, even when they were playing by the rules of the day.
Well, I think that's the answer, really, is no shame, no guilt. But our next kind of like follow-up parenting advice is now you know better. You
Mm.
know better. Now we know better. We didn't know then, but now we know. And now that we know, we can't keep going the way that we've been going. We have to do something. We can't keep on going the way that we've been going. We have to do something. We know better now. It's not your fault, and there's so many reasons why it's not, it is not individually our fault. We
Mhm.
are embedded within systems that are, kind of um, traumatic. But now we know better, and so we have to act, and we have to act differently, and we need to clean up our mess. So I think the
Yeah.
important point is no shame, no blame, but accountability, responsibility, and the people who have the capacity to act uh, should.
Mhm.
And that
Interesting.
extends to oil and gas companies for sure, right? We know better now. They know better. They made the mess and they need to clean it up. And my own personal opinion is that we need to take our public dollars and we need to invest them in protection and preparation and health and all of those things. And they can pay for their own technology and their own business, et cetera, R&D, blah, blah, blah. Um, but that might be a bigger conversation for another time.
Something's really powerful there, though. You said is like, well, we know better now. And so there are a couple of things you come up for me though, Amber, because earlier you said, well, maybe people aren't so sure about the relationship between, all this pollution and the extreme fires that we're witnessing right now. Like there's a lot of steps in that conversation to draw the connection. And so you were earlier talking about a literacy gap, and I'm like, do we know better, or is there a large enough part of the population that's still uncertain? And then Megan, when you think about Gen Squeeze more generally, like when we're talking to an older demographic, well, you paid taxes according to the rules of the day, but it wasn't actually enough to cover the medical care you now want. I don't think most people actually know that. So it's like, we can't say you know better yet. We're still in that kind of hard truth space. And even with regards to housing unaffordability, like, well, on our watch, home prices have made, especially in Ontario and BC, many homeowners who've been in homeowners for decades, much wealthier, but at the cost of real harm to your kids and grandchildren. And maybe that's becoming more known. So I guess we're in this moment of like having to figure out like, when can we say like, well, we now know better, and when do we still have work to do to tell these hard truths so that we come to know better, so we can take the accountability that Amber was talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say I think it is important to say that Canadians make sense of climate change through extreme weather, right? So it underscores, it underpins, and it strengthens their belief that climate change is real and it's happening, their experiences of natural disasters and extreme weather. But the understanding that burning fossil fuels creates a heat trapping blanket that is increasing, extreme weather and natural disasters, that piece is not necessarily well laid down. Partly because we talk about GHG emissions and we talk about carbon, and we've made it quite complicated, and sometimes for some actors on purpose. But I think if we can get to the point of simplifying as much as possible, that to stop the heat trapping blanket, we need to stop polluting. That's basically it. That would be really helpful to um, to strengthen and harden off for people.
Okay, this is wonderful and fun, and I've really enjoyed talking to you, but I am aware of how much I'm going to edit after this too, so I'm going to stop.
Great.
But thank you so much for joining us. I will give you one chance. Was there anything you really wanted to talk about with us that we didn't get to touch on?
No, I mean, I'm going to say it out loud. I think that this election is about a lot of things, but probably not about climate change. And that's okay because the work around climate change, I think, happens between elections in Alberta. It is not during elections because it's just such a toxic topic for a lot of for politicians. So I think the work around climate happens between elections. This particular election we know is about healthcare, it's about education, it's about affordability. The one place where there could be an opportunity is just around that, diversification and the degree to which governments have a plan and a vision for this province. I think that that's really clear. Albertans want leaders that have a vision of where we're going, and they're not interested in going back, right? They want to go forward, and they want leadership that does that. And so that would be my advice for communicators. Start the conversation on climate policy on May 30th. But for right now, it's not really, no, it's not what this election's about.
Well, there's so much more that I'd love to chat with. I think maybe we need to make Amber like a regular, come back quarterly or something. I mean, in an election, it's all about health, and the World Health Organization talks about climate change being the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century. I'm like, there's some connections there.
And health systems, right?
Exactly. So, but those are dialogues for another day.